There are men who buy power and men who inherit it, but Desmond Greco built his with his own 2 hands, and the foundation he poured was made of fear. At 37, he ran the Brooklyn waterfront the way other men run their bloodstream, quietly, constantly, without ever needing to think about it, and the name Greco was the kind of name people lowered their voices to say in restaurants where the back booths were always reserved. To the city, he was a real estate magnate, a maritime investor, a recluse photographed, maybe twice a decade, stepping out of a black car with the collar of his coat turned up. To the families who actually mattered, the ones who'd survived 3 wars and a dozen federal indictments, he was the most dangerous Don the Eastern Seaboard had produced in 50 years. A man who could end a life with a nod and sleep like a child afterward. He felt nothing, or so everyone believed, and Desmond had spent 20 years cultivating that flawless reputation, because emotional detachment was the only shield that had ever kept him alive. Yet there he sat, in a penthouse office swallowed by shadow, turning a gold-embossed wedding invitation over and over in his scarred hands, and for the first time in 20 years, the most feared man in New York didn't have the faintest idea what to do. His little sister was getting married, and a single empty chair beside him at that altar could unravel everything he'd bled to build. 3 floors below his empire, in a building she didn't even know he owned, a woman named Maeve Donnelly was on her knees at midnight, scrubbing wax off a marble floor she'd never be invited to walk across in daylight. She was 28, and she was tired in a way that sleep couldn't reach. By day she catalogued the estates of dead millionaires, appraising heirlooms she'd never afford, and by night she cleaned the offices of men whose worlds she could only dust. She had a 5-year-old daughter named Poppy, waiting with a neighbor, a mother dying slowly behind a hospital curtain she couldn't keep paying for, and a spine she absolutely wouldn't bend, no matter how heavy the week got. When the most powerful criminal in the city finally walked into that quiet archive room and looked at her, expecting the same thing he always got, fear, deference, that little flinch of recognition, Maeve looked back at him like he was just one more man interrupting her work, and she told him to get his coffee off the antique table before she made him regret it. And Desmond Greco, who hadn't been spoken to that way since he was a boy, felt something behind his ribs that he thought had died a long time ago. What he didn't know yet, what not a soul in that room of kneeling killers could have guessed, was that this exhausted single mother in borrowed shoes carried a tarnished silver ring beneath her collar. A ring stamped with a name the families had buried in the harbor 30 years before, a name that, once it was spoken aloud, would bring the entire empire he'd built crashing to its knees. If you love stories where the underestimated woman walks into a room full of monsters and walks out their queen, do me a favor and hit that like button right now. Share this with someone who believes the quiet ones are always the most dangerous, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a single chapter of what's coming. Now let's step into that shadowed penthouse and meet the man the whole city fears. On the night everything he built began to change, the man named Priest set the thin file on the ebony tabletop, and in the room there was only the ticking of the antique clock echoing like the heartbeat of a sleeping beast. Desmond did not rush to touch it. He stood beside the floor-to-ceiling glass window, looking down at the harbor lights flickering beneath the night fog, and let his oldest advisor speak first, as he had always done for 20 years. Priest was the only man in the entire Greco Empire allowed to call him by his real name, the only one who had seen him when he was still a skinny boy sleeping on church steps, and the only one he still trusted, though that trust was as thin as first-season ice. "She is surprisingly clean," Priest said, his voice rough as sandpaper dragged across wood. "Maeve Donnelly, 28 years old, born in Queens. No criminal record, no gambling debts, no suspicious lover, not one connection to any family in the city. Only debt. A great deal of debt." Desmond turned back, his eyes moving over the photograph clipped to the corner of the file. The face of the woman who had dared tell him to lift his coffee cup off the antique table only a few hours earlier. In the picture, she was not smiling. She was merely looking straight into the lens with tired eyes that still refused to lower themselves. "Go on," he said. Priest turned a page. "Single mother. She has a 5-year-old daughter named Poppy. The child's father disappeared before the girl could even walk. No support, no contact. Her mother, Eilish Donnelly, is in intensive care at East Brooklyn Hospital. End-stage kidney failure, dialysis 3 times a week, and the bills are higher than she is. Her insurance stopped covering the costs 3 months ago. She is working 2 jobs at once, appraising estates for an auction house by day, cleaning at night. She cleans this very building, Desmond, the 19th floor. She does not even know who pays her. Something inside Desmond's chest shifted, something he did not name, something he did not allow himself to name. He was used to looking at other people as pieces on a board, as numbers, as weaknesses to exploit. But this woman, a woman sinking up to her neck in a sea of debts she had not created, had looked at him as though he were no more frightening than a burned-out light bulb. That was exactly what he needed. Someone outside the system. Someone who could not be bought with power because she had never tasted it, could not be threatened with death, because she was already carrying an exhaustion that eclipsed any threat, and could not be swayed by glitter because she had seen through its emptiness, from inside the rooms she cleaned every night. Serafina Voss would never expect a card like that. The thought of Serafina made his jaw tighten. That widow had spread word through the council that she would walk into Bianca's wedding on his arm, turning a family alliance into a declaration of reunion, placing one foot inside his empire without his permission. If he arrived alone, he would look like a man backed into a corner. If he brought anyone from their world, he would ignite a battle for position inside his own house. He needed someone who belonged to no board at all. "There is one more thing," Priest said, and this time his voice slowed, more cautious, as though he were stepping across a sheet of ice he was not sure could bear his weight. Her maternal line. Eilish's mother. I dug a little deeper, only out of habit. Maeve's grandmother's maiden name was Houlihan. The room seemed to stop. Desmond did not move, but something in his eyes changed, a stillness deeper than his usual stillness. The stillness of a man who had just heard an echo from a room that should have been sealed forever. Houlihan. The name touched something buried very deep, a story he had overheard when he was a child, a name people never spoke aloud, an old scar on the body of the very underworld he ruled. He did not know what it meant. Perhaps it meant nothing at all. Houlihan was a common Irish name, carried by thousands of people scattered across the 5 boroughs. Coincidence, he told himself. Only coincidence. But Desmond Greco had survived to 37 in a world that buried men who believed in coincidence, and his instinct, the instinct that had saved his life more often than any gun, was now humming with a low, cold note he could not ignore. Find out more about that name, he said softly, his voice revealing nothing. Quietly. Do not let anyone know you are digging. Priest nodded, but his old eyes lingered on Desmond's face for a moment, probing. And what about her? Should I cross her off the list? Desmond looked back at the photograph, at the face of the woman who possessed an unyielding gaze, and for the first time in a very long while, he made a decision that was not entirely based on calculation. No, he said. Arrange a meeting. I will speak with her myself. The next day, when Maeve was led into an office she had never set foot in before, not through the employee elevator, but through a private elevator paneled in gleaming walnut, she knew something was not right. She was still wearing her everyday appraisal clothes, the cardigan frayed at the elbows, her hair hastily twisted up with a pencil, and she stepped into the office of the most powerful man in the city with the air of someone coming to demand unpaid wages, holding her ground with absolute composure. Desmond rose when she entered, a gesture that made her falter for half a second, because no wealthy man she had ever served had ever bothered to stand for a cleaning woman. Please sit down, Miss Donnelly, he said. I can stand, Maeve replied, folding her arms, Mr. Greco. If this is about the antique table last night, let me say this now. I'm not taking back a single word. You put a 17th century file beside a fireplace, and I did my job. If you're going to fire me, then do it quickly. I have to pick up my daughter. The corner of Desmond's mouth twitched something almost like a smile, though it never fully formed. I'm not going to fire you. I'm going to hire you. For another job, he gestured, and Priest placed a gold-embossed wedding invitation on the desk. My sister Bianca is getting married this weekend at the Fontaine estate on Long Island. It is a private event, very closed, with guests whose names you will never read in the papers. I need someone to accompany me. A fiancé. For one evening, Maeve looked at him as though he had just spoken in some alien language. You're joking. I never joke about business, Mr. Greco. Do you realize you're talking to the woman who mops your floors? I'm not an actress. I don't own an evening gown. I don't know how to hold the right fork at a dinner where people use 6 forks. And I haven't slept properly in 2 years. All of that can be solved, except the last part. And I'm afraid no one in that room sleeps any better than you do." He walked around the desk slowly, and for the first time she realized he moved without making a sound at all, like something that had learned how to hunt a very long time ago. "In return, I will pay the entire cost of your mother's treatment at East Brooklyn Hospital. Not only the amount already owed, but all of it until she no longer needs it. I will transfer $500,000 into your account, and you and your daughter will have an apartment in your name, not rented, in any neighborhood in the city you choose." The room swayed beneath Maeve's feet. The pencil tucked into her hair suddenly seemed heavy. She was used to small numbers counted dollar by dollar for milk and medicine, numbers that kept her awake all night calculating whether this month she should pay the hospital bill or the electric bill. The number he had just spoken did not belong to her world. It was the kind of money that could save her mother's life, could put a real roof over Poppy's head, could erase the constant fear that had been eating her from the inside for 2 years. And precisely because it was too much, something in her instantly went on guard. "No," she said, her voice hoarse but firm. "No one pays that much money for one evening unless there is a reason to be afraid. I don't know what kind of man you are, Mr. Greco, but I know the smell of trouble, and you reek of it. I'm not selling myself. I have lived my whole life decently, without needing money from men who don't dare tell me what they really do for a living." She turned to leave, and she truly would have left if her gaze had not accidentally fallen on the photograph. On the phone she was gripping tightly in her hand, Poppy's round face, her dimpled cheeks and gap-toothed smile. The child who did not know her grandmother was fading behind a hospital curtain, who did not know her mother cried in the bathroom every night so she would not hear. Maeve stopped. She stood motionless for a long time, her back to him, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed, lower, more unsteady, like the voice of someone who had just set down something she had carried for far too long. "One evening," she said, "one condition. You can put me in your dress, your jewelry, teach me how to hold your 6 forks. But you do not lie to me about anything that could leave my daughter without a mother. If that room is dangerous, you tell me honestly how dangerous it is." "I have lost too many people already, Mr. Greco. My little girl only has me." Desmond looked at her for a long time, and in that moment he thought of the name Houlihan, of the low, cold note that had not stopped humming in his mind, of all the things he had not said, and perhaps would never say. "I promise," he replied, and it was the first lie he ever told her. The afternoon before the wedding, Maeve was taken up to a floor she had never known existed, a windowless room as wide as a stage, hung with mirrors from floor to ceiling, and thick with the smell of expensive perfume mixed with new fabric. Waiting for her there was a gaunt woman with silver hair cut sharp as a blade and gray eyes cold as steel. A woman who introduced herself only as Madame Renata and did not bother to ask Maeve's name. She circled Maeve once, slowly, like a sculptor judging a rough block of stone, then released a disappointed sigh through her nose. "Your shoulders are stiff as a woman about to stand trial," Renata said, her voice carrying an accent Maeve could not quite place. "Your hands are calloused. Your back bends because you have spent too much time leaning down, and the dark circles under your eyes are deep enough to bury a man. That is called working 2 jobs and raising a child alone," Maeve answered flatly. "You should try it. It might become fashionable." Renata paused for half a second, and then something almost like a smile passed across the edge of her thin mouth. "You have a sharp tongue. Good. You will need it more than you think where you are going." For the next 3 hours, Maeve was turned and handled like a doll beneath the hands of half a dozen people, measured, pinned, pulled into layers of fabric whose price she did not even dare ask. They washed her tangled hair and loosened it into soft, dark waves, erased the shadows beneath her eyes with powders she could not name, and when at last they slipped her into the deep blue-black silk gown, a dress that did not glitter or shout, but simply wrapped around her like dark water, she almost did not recognize the figure in the mirror. The woman looking back at her from the glass had straight shoulders, a slender bare throat, and a calmness Maeve had not known she possessed. Renata clipped diamond earrings onto her ears, placed a delicate necklace around her throat, then reached for her hand to remove the old silver ring Maeve always wore on her middle finger. Maeve snatched her hand back so quickly the whole room went still. "Not this," she said. "It does not suit the dress." Renata frowned. "It is old, tarnished, cheap metal. It will ruin everything." "It belonged to my grandfather," Maeve replied, her voice suddenly leaving no room for argument. "He died before I was born, but my mother said he never took it off his hand. It is the only thing of his left in my house. It has gone through war, poverty, and 3 generations of women in my family, and it will not be taken off just because it does not match a borrowed dress on a borrowed evening. If you want it gone, you will have to cut off my hand." A strange silence filled the room, and Renata, the woman who had dressed some of the most powerful people on this continent, looked at the girl for a moment with an unreadable gaze, then nodded. "Then hide it," she said softly, sliding the ring onto a thin silver chain and fastening it around Maeve's neck, letting it rest hidden beneath the silk, pressed against her breastbone like a secret. "Do not let them see your fear, and do not let them see anything you do not want them to see." At exactly 6 o'clock that evening, the door opened and Desmond Greco stepped inside. He wore a pitch-black tuxedo tailored so perfectly, it looked as though it had been poured over him, and he entered with the bearing of a man accustomed to making an entire room hold its breath when he appeared. But when his eyes met Maeve, he was the one who stopped. The scowling woman in the frayed cardigan had vanished, and standing in her place was someone he had no ready word for. A beauty that did not live in the dress or the earrings, but in the way she held her spine straight in the middle of a world built to make women like her bow their heads. For one very brief moment, the man who had not revealed anything for 20 years forgot how to hide. "What are you looking at, Mr. Greco?" Maeve asked, one eyebrow lifting. "I thought you had seen enough beautiful things in your life." He recovered his composure, but half a beat slower than usual. "I was thinking," he replied, "that I owe you an apology. I underestimated you." His gaze accidentally slipped down to the curve of her throat, to the place where the thin silver chain disappeared beneath the silk, and for one extremely brief moment he felt something vague and sharp stir, a low note he could not catch in time, and then it was gone. "Another $1,000,000 for this corset, Greco," she said, reaching for the shawl. "Now let's go before I change my mind." The car sped through the night toward Long Island, a sleek black machine with soundproof glass so thick that the city outside had faded into a distant memory, and in that spacious rear cabin Maeve sat across from Desmond, feeling the space between them narrow with every mile. For the first half hour he said nothing, only looked out the window with the expression of a man preparing to step into battle, and that very silence made her more uneasy than any warning could have. Then he turned back, and when he spoke his voice had changed, no longer the polished businesslike courtesy of the afternoon, but cold and heavy as stone. "Listen to me carefully, Maeve, because I will only say this once. Tonight you do not leave my side by half a step. You do not go to the restroom alone. You do not step onto a balcony for air. You do not take a phone call in a corner. Wherever you go, I go, or you stand still beside me. If anyone offers you food or drink, you refuse, politely but firmly, and you never set down a glass of wine and pick it up again after you have taken your eyes off it. If someone asks you to dance, you look at me first. And if a woman named Serafina Voss comes near you, you do not let her touch you, you do not accept anything from her hand, and you call for me immediately." Maeve listened to all of it, and with every sentence he spoke, the knot in her stomach tightened. "Are you describing a wedding reception," she said slowly, "or a minefield?" "Both," he replied without smiling. She looked at him for a long time in the flashing spill of streetlights across his sharply cut face, and she felt the fear she had held down all day finally creep up into her throat. "The people where we are going," she said softly, "can they kill someone, Mr. Greco?" "I'm not asking for amusement. I promised you something, and you promised me something in return, so I'm asking plainly. Is it possible I might not come home to my daughter tonight?" There was a long silence, and inside that silence Maeve saw something pass over his face, a hesitation she suspected appeared there very rarely. "As long as you stay beside me," he said at last, "no one will dare touch a hair on your head. I give you my word. But I will not lie to you because that was your condition. The people in that room have done things that would keep you from sleeping if you knew them. They wear tuxedos and drink expensive wine, but they are not businessmen, and neither am I." Maeve swallowed hard. "Then what are you? Truly, I have cleaned your floors for an entire year, without knowing whose floors I was cleaning." He looked at her, and for the first time that night their locked gazes held a silent mutual understanding. "I am the man those people are afraid of," he said simply. "My family does not make its money from real estate, though the papers say we do. We control the harbor, what passes through it, who is allowed to pass through it. I inherited it in blood and I have kept it in blood, and I have done things that, if I told you, would make you never let me near your daughter again." She thought she would feel disgust when she heard that confession, but instead she felt something strange, a nameless sorrow for the man sitting before her, because she realized he was not saying those words with pride or boasting, but with a deep weariness, the exhaustion of someone who had carried something far too heavy for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to set it down. "You're lonely," she said, and it was not a question. He snapped his gaze toward her, as though she had touched a wound no one had ever dared to touch. "You know nothing about me. I know people who are not lonely do not need to hire a stranger to pretend to be their fiancé," Maeve answered gently. "And I know the way you looked at your sister's wedding invitation, even though you thought no one noticed. You're not afraid of the people in that room, Mr. Greco. You're afraid of the empty chair beside you." He did not answer. He turned back to the window, his jaw tight, and for the rest of the drive, neither of them spoke another word. But something inside the car had changed, a fragile thread drawn tight between two people who should never have met, as the enormous iron gates of the Fontaine estate began to appear in the darkness ahead. The Fontaine estate appeared beyond the iron gates like a castle from another world, its sweeping lawns lit by thousands of flickering candles, its rows of perfectly trimmed trees, and a massive stone mansion with white columns rising into the night like the spine of a beast that had slept for centuries. When the car stopped before the stone steps, Desmond stepped out first and offered her his hand, and the moment her fingers settled into his palm, Maeve felt the cold steadiness in that grip, as though he were giving her a piece of the strength she was about to need. They climbed the steps, and when the enormous oak doors opened before them, the whole world inside seemed to stop. The vast hall was flooded with golden candlelight and the tender sound of strings, filled with people so beautiful they were almost frightening. Men in tailored tuxedos and women in silk and diamonds, all moving with a grace that felt somehow unnatural, like predators who had learned how to pretend to be human. And when Desmond Greco entered with an unfamiliar woman on his arm, the strings stumbled over a single note, hundreds of perfectly sculpted faces turned toward them, and a strange silence spread through the room like frost crawling over glass. Maeve felt the weight of those gazes pressing against her skin, and it was not ordinary curiosity, but something hungry, searching, calculating, as though the entire room were deciding all at once whether she was a threat or prey. Her heart pounded, but she kept her chin high, her shoulders straight, exactly as Renata had told her. Desmond felt her heartbeat through the hand resting on his arm, and he shifted half a step forward, a change in posture so small it was almost invisible, but enough for the whole room to understand. He did not say a word. He simply let his power radiate outward, an invisible pressure that made the air in the hall seem to thicken, and one by one, those who had been looking at her with hungry eyes began to lower their gazes, some even retreating half a step with discreet bows of the head. The message was so clear it needed no words. "She belongs to me. Do not look." "Breathe, Maeve," he whispered, so softly only she could hear. "You're doing very well." But before they could take another step, the crowd parted, and a woman approached with the gait of a knife slicing through silk. She wore a deep wine-red gown that clung to her body, her blonde hair swept into a flawless high twist, her lips painted blood red, and she was beautiful in a way that made people want to stare and step back at the same time. She did not bother to glance at Maeve for even a second. "Desmond, darling," Serafina Voss said, her voice sickeningly sweet, honey laced with poison. "I was beginning to think you would sulk in your tower all evening. You almost missed Bianca's vows." "I am always on time, Serafina," Desmond replied, his voice flat as a sheet of ice. "You know that." Only then did Serafina's gaze slowly slide toward Maeve, sweeping over her from head to foot with undisguised contempt, her eyes pausing at Maeve's hands, searching for the calluses the powder could not fully erase. "And what little creature is this?" she said, loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "A late-night appetizer." "Truly, Desmond, bringing takeout to a royal wedding is painfully vulgar. Which service counter did you pick her up from?" A few soft laughs stirred around them, and that was the moment Maeve's fear evaporated completely, replaced by something hot and familiar, the spirit of a woman who had endured too much contempt to tremble before one more person. "Actually," Maeve said, her voice clear and bright in the suddenly silent hall, "I am his girlfriend, and I would appreciate it if you did not speak about me, as though I were a plate of food. She tilted her head, letting her gaze move over Serafina's blazing red dress with a deadly sweet smile. Though looking at that dress, I do understand why you're so obsessed with devouring things. Red is a very bold color for someone trying to pretend she isn't desperate. A collective gasp rippled through the surrounding crowd. No one, absolutely no one, had ever dared speak to Serafina Voss in that tone. Desmond had to clear his throat to cover the laugh that almost escaped, and his hand at Maeve's waist tightened, not as a warning, but from a pride he did not manage to hide in time. Serafina's eyes flashed with a livid anger, and in that instant, all the false elegance on her face dissolved, revealing what lay beneath. Serafina had taken another step forward, her eyes streaked with a dangerous light, and Maeve knew she had just lit the fuse on something she could not control. But before the woman could say another word, a deep, commanding voice rang out, cutting across the hall like a blade. "Enough, Serafina." The crowd parted again, and this time the man who stepped forward was a tall old gentleman, with hair white as spun silver and a presence that made the entire room fall silent by instinct. This was Augustine Fontaine, father of the groom, master of the estate, the oldest and most respected Don still living on the East Coast. A man whose words carried the weight of law in this underworld. "There will be no blood spilled before the wedding vows," he said, flicking his hand to send Serafina away as though dismissing an irritating insect, and she retreated in resentment but did not dare argue. Then Augustine turned to Desmond, a diplomatic smile blooming across his wrinkled face. "Desmond, my boy, we are honored you came." "Augustine," Desmond replied, lowering his head with a rare show of respect. "Allow me to introduce," but Desmond did not finish the sentence, because Augustine Fontaine's gaze had just left him and settled on Maeve's face, and something strange happened. The diplomatic smile on the old man's mouth stiffened, then vanished completely. His eyes, the eyes that had witnessed 3 gang wars and buried more enemies than the number of years Maeve had been alive, now moved over every line of her face with a growing horror. The cheekbones, the shape of her chin, and especially the hazel color in her eyes, as though he were seeing a ghost rise from a grave he had filled with his own hands. She lifted a hand instinctively when she felt that stare, and that very movement shifted the delicate silver chain at her throat, letting her grandfather's old signet ring slip out from beneath the silk and gleam for an instant in the candlelight. That instant was enough. The wineglass in Augustine Fontaine's hand slipped from his trembling fingers and fell onto the marble floor, shattering with a sharp sound that echoed through the now dead silent hall, the dark red liquid spreading across the white stone like a wound suddenly torn open. No one moved. Hundreds of immortal predators in that room held their breath at once, all eyes fixed on the old Don as he staggered back a step, his face drained of every drop of blood, his lips moving as though he were trying to speak a name he had not dared call for 30 years. "Sorcy," he whispered, and the name fell into the silence like a stone dropped into a deep well. Maeve frowned, a chill running down her spine. "I don't know who that is," she said, her voice still remarkably calm, though her heart was pounding like a war drum. "My name is Maeve Donnelly," but Augustine did not seem to hear her. He stepped closer, then closer again, his old eyes now shining with something between fear and a chilling reverence, his gaze never leaving the ring swinging at her throat. "That face," he said, his voice breaking. "That ring. I would know that seal anywhere, even at the bottom of hell. You cannot have it. It is impossible. We buried you in the harbor 30 years ago." I stood there and watched. A wave of horrified whispers spread through the room, the oldest Dons exchanging panicked glances, several of them already going pale, as though the name Fiancée had awakened something they had all tried to forget together for 3 decades. Desmond stood motionless beside her, and in his mind, the low, cold note he had heard in the dark office the night before now exploded into a deafening bell. The Houlihan name priest had whispered, her strange immunity to his power, the ring she would rather die than remove, all the scattered pieces suddenly beginning to turn and lock together into a shape he still did not dare believe. Maeve turned to look at him, and for the first time that night, real fear was clear in her eyes, a silent plea for help. "Desmond," she whispered, "what the hell is he talking about?" But Desmond could not answer, because for the first time in 20 years, the most dangerous man in New York was not sure what the answer was either. Augustine Fontaine stood motionless in the middle of the hall, and then, like an old dam finally giving way, he began to speak. his trembling voice carrying the weight of 30 years of buried guilt. 3 decades ago, he said, and the whole room seemed to lean toward him to listen. Before that harbor belonged to the Greco family. Before any of the children standing here tonight had even been born, there was a man named Cormac Houlihan. He was not a gunman, not a Don, not a cold-blooded killer. He was the bookkeeper, the mind behind everything. Cormac was the only one who understood the flow of every dollar that moved through that harbor, the only one who knew how to turn dirty money clean, how to hide it, how to build. Without him, there would have been no empire at all. We were only a pack of thugs fighting over a few crates. Cormac was the one who turned us into kings. He stopped, his old eyes dimming with memory. And he did something clever, so clever that in the end it killed him. He placed everything, all the legal papers for the harbor, every clean asset visible on the surface, in his wife's name. A woman, Sarsa Houlihan. She was the sole legal heir to all of it, according to the laws of the upper world we still hide behind. Cormac thought that if everything stood in the name of someone clean, with no criminal record, no connections, then no one could touch it. He thought he was protecting his family. Augustine's voice broke, and for the first time Maeve realized he was not merely telling a story, he was confessing. But power corrupts the heart, girl. When the men who sat at Cormac's table realized that the entire empire, on paper, belonged to a married couple with no army of their own to protect them, greed won. The fathers of the men standing in this room, the grandfathers of some of those younger men there, and me too, I will not lie to you. All of us sat together in a dark room and decided the Houlihans had to disappear, not because they had betrayed us, but because they owned what we wanted. A horrified whisper spread through the crowd. We removed Cormac first, Augustine continued, every word falling from his mouth like a heavy stone. Then Sorcy. We erased the Houlihan name from every ledger, every document, every memory. We burned their house, bought the people who knew the truth, and threatened the ones we could not buy. We told ourselves that bloodline was extinct, that no one was left to claim what belonged to them. For 30 years, I slept peacefully with that lie. He lifted his eyes to Maeve, and now there was pure horror in them. But they missed someone. Fiancée had a daughter, hidden away, raised under another name, in another place. And that daughter had a daughter. And now the daughter of that daughter is standing in my hall, wearing Cormac's ring around her neck, with the face of the woman I gave the order to kill with my own hands. The silence after those words grew so thick, Maeve could hear the blood rushing in her ears. She was the last descendant. She was all that remained of a bloodline the people in this room had tried to wipe from the earth. And then, cutting through that horrified stillness, a shrill voice rang out in triumph. Then, what are you all waiting for? Serafina Voss stepped out of the crowd, her face twisting with a mixture of fear and calculation. Did you not hear what he said? The girl is the remnant of a bloodline our ancestors spilled blood to erase. If she lives, she will claim everything back. Everything beneath your feet, everything you call your own. By our own laws, the Houlihan bloodline should have been extinct. Finish what your fathers began right now, before it is too late. And Maeve felt the entire room begin to close around her like a trap snapping shut. The crowd edged closer, the figures in tuxedos and silk tightening their circle, and Maeve felt Desmond's hand settle at her waist, ready to pull her behind him. But instead of hiding behind his back, she stepped forward, and it was her sudden calm that made the whole room falter. Because while the entire hall stared at her like a ghost, inside Maeve's mind, the mind of an estate appraisal specialist, the scattered pieces of the past 2 years suddenly began fitting together with dizzying clarity. The file, she said, and though her voice was soft, it carried through the deathly silent room. Mr. Greco, the collection of documents you bought at auction last month, the one I have been appraising in your archive. Do you know what it really is? Desmond slowly turned to look at her, and she saw a new wariness in his eyes. It is the estate of a bankrupt family, he replied. I bought the whole lot because it was connected to the history of the harbor. No, Maeve said, and this time a strange smile flickered across her lips. The smile of a woman who had finally understood the joke fate had been playing on her all her life. It is not connected to the history of the harbor. It is the harbor. I have spent the last 72 hours bent over those documents, Mr. Greco, and I will tell you what I found, because I am good at exactly one thing in this life, and that is reading things other people think are dead. She turned back to face Augustine, and now the old man was the one who looked as though he might collapse. Inside that file are notarized documents, she said clearly, word by word. Originals, with raised seals, with the signatures of notaries, executed according to the laws of the state of New York. Certificates of ownership for the entire harbor district, the warehouses, the legal entities that appear on the surface. And every one of those papers bears one name. Not Fontaine, not Greco, Houlihan, Cyrus Houlihan. They were drawn up more than 30 years ago and were never legally voided, because you cannot cancel a person's ownership simply by making that person disappear. Legally, ladies and gentlemen, those papers remain valid to this very moment. A panicked murmur rose, but Maeve did not stop. And there is something else, she continued, lifting her hand to touch the silver ring at her throat. A will, Cormac Houlihan's. I read it without knowing the man who wrote it was my grandfather. In it, he wrote that everything he left behind would be locked inside a safe, and that the key to opening it was not a number, not a password, but an object, a family seal, engraved on a silver ring passed down to the last woman of the bloodline. She removed the chain from her neck and lifted the ring into the candlelight, so the entire room could see the old seal carved into its face, the same seal Augustin Fontaine had just sworn he would recognize anywhere. I have worn this all my life, thinking it was only a cheap keepsake from an old man I never met, she said, her voice trembling with an emotion she had no time to name. My mother forbade museum experts from studying it. I always thought that was because she was stubborn. Now I understand. She was protecting the one thing that could prove who we are. This is not jewelry, ladies and gentlemen. This is the key, and whatever it opens will prove every word I have just said. The room fell into a silence so deep that the dripping of candle wax could be heard. Serafina opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out, because now everyone in that hall understood the terrible truth. The woman they had been about to eliminate was not an imposter, not a pawn Desmond had brought to play at politics. She was the legal owner of the ground beneath all their feet. The silence stretched so long it seemed almost solid enough to touch, and then something no one in that room could have imagined took place. Augustine Fontaine, the oldest and most respected Don on the East Coast. The man whose word carried the weight of law slowly sank down. His aged knees touched the cold marble floor beside the pool of red wine, still spreading across the stone, and he lowered his white head before the woman in the borrowed dress. "Madame," he said, and his voice was no longer the voice of a ruler, but of a sinner finally standing before his judgment. 30 years ago, I committed a crime no prayer can ever wash clean. I helped erase your bloodline. I do not ask for your forgiveness, because I do not deserve to be forgiven. But law is law, and honor is honor, and those things are older than the greed that made us betray them. What belongs to the Houlihan family must be returned to the Houlihan family. Maeve stood frozen, the ring still dangling from her trembling fingers, unable to believe what she was witnessing. And then, like a wave spreading out from the heart of an impact, it began to multiply. A gray-haired Don in the corner of the room knelt. Then another. Then an entire family on the west side of the hall sank to their knees together. Because every one of them, behind those horrified faces, was making the same cold calculation in his mind. If those original papers came to light, if they were brought before the courts of the upper world they had always hidden behind, then everything they owned, every harbor, every warehouse, every empire built on that stolen foundation, would collapse overnight. Their assets would be frozen, investigated, seized. Kneeling before this woman was not surrender. It was the only way to survive. Only her recognition, only her mercy, could keep the underworld empire they had built with blood from turning to ash beneath the light of the law. One by one, hundreds of the most powerful predators on the East Coast, men who had survived wars and federal indictments, lowered their heads before a 28-year-old estate appraisal specialist in borrowed shoes. Only Serafina Voss remained standing alone amid the sea of kneeling bodies, her face pale, her eyes darting wildly around in search of an ally who no longer existed, her plan to corner Desmond backfiring in the most horrifying way she could have imagined. But Maeve could hardly pay attention to her anymore, because amid all of it, she turned her head and met Desmond's eyes, and he was looking at her in a way no one had ever looked at her in her entire life. Not as a piece he had bought, not as an employee he had hired, not as a beautiful woman in an expensive dress. He looked at her as an equal force, something that had walked into a room full of predators and made every one of them kneel without drawing any weapon, except her own intelligence and courage. In those usually cold and unreadable eyes, there was now a new light, a deep respect mingled with something hotter, more dangerous, something he had buried for 20 years, and that was now rising beyond his control. Maeve looked down at the red wine on the white stone, at the bowed heads around her, at the most dangerous man in New York, looking at her as though she had just overturned his entire world, and a strange thought rang through her mind amid the shock. That morning, she had still been kneeling on a floor wiping up candle wax, and now, an entire empire was kneeling at her feet. "I think," she said softly, her voice trembling but not breaking, her eyes still locked on Desmond's. "My consulting fee just went up, Mr. Greco." Something almost tender had just flickered in Desmond's eyes when he heard those words, the corner of his mouth barely beginning to open into something almost like a smile. And perhaps that was precisely what Serafina Voss could no longer endure, left standing alone in a sea of kneeling bodies, forced to watch the man she had wanted for so many years look at someone else with an expression she had never received. She lost the last thread of reason she had left. With a shrill hiss tearing from her throat, she lunged toward Maeve, so fast her red dress ripped through the air like a streak of blood, her hands reaching forward with a flash of metal gleaming between her fingers, a sharp object she had hidden somewhere on herself all evening. Everything happened in less than a heartbeat. Maeve had not even had time to understand what was happening, not time to step back, not time to raise her hands to protect herself. But Desmond had. He had read the murder in Serafina's eyes before she even moved, and he moved with a speed his large body should not have possessed. Turning to place himself between Maeve and the blade driving toward her, using his own body as a shield. There was a dry sound, a strangled rush of breath, and then Desmond staggered half a step back, one hand gripping Maeve's shoulder to keep his balance, the other pressed hard against his side. When he pulled that hand away, his fingers were stained dark. The whole room exploded. 2 large Greco men surged out of the shadows where they had been silently standing guard, subduing Serafina within seconds, wrenching her arms behind her back and stripping the sharp object from her hand while she struggled and screamed, curses that had lost all meaning. But Maeve heard none of it. Her world had narrowed to the man standing in front of her, the man who had just placed his body between her and death. "Desmond," she cried, and her voice broke on his name. She reached out to support him as he swayed, not caring that her expensive silk gown was being stained, not caring that the whole room was watching. "Do not move. Let me see. Look at me, look at me." He tried to force a smile, but pain twisted it out of shape. "It is only a surface wound," he said, though his breathing had grown shallow and quick. "I have endured far worse." "Be quiet and sit down," she ordered, and the sharpness in her voice hid the panic rising inside her. She helped him into a chair, her hands, so used to fragile old papers, now trembling, as she pressed her shawl hard against the wound in his side to stop the bleeding. And while she did it, something inside her chest was breaking apart, because she suddenly realized a truth this terrible evening had never given her time to understand. This man, the cold-blooded criminal, the whole city feared, the man who had admitted he had done things that would make her never want him near her daughter, had just put his life between her and a blade without hesitation. He had not calculated. He had not weighed how much she was worth on his board. He had simply moved. "Why?" she whispered, lifting her eyes to his, and this time there was no layer of ice there for her to break through. "You do not even know me. I am only the woman who cleans your floors. Why would you do that?" Desmond looked at her for a long time, his face pale, but his eyes lit with something he had not allowed anyone to see for 2 decades. And in that moment, amid the candlelit hall with a restrained enemy, screaming behind them and an entire empire kneeling around them, he seemed to be asking himself the same question. "I do not know," he replied, and it was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. They took him into a private room in the east wing of the estate, where a quiet man the Greco family always brought to every event silently stitched the wound in Desmond's side, with the practiced motions of someone who had done this many times before. Maeve sat beside him and still had not left, though she could not understand why she was staying. And it was in that stillness after the storm, when the adrenaline had drained away and her mind began working again with its natural sharpness, that the pieces she had not had time to notice began to scrape against one another, in a way that made her uneasy. She remembered the way Priest, the old advisor, had looked at her when she stepped into the office to accept the offer, A look she had assumed was ordinary scrutiny. She remembered what Desmond had said in the car, that the people in that room had done things that would keep her from sleeping if she knew, words that now carried a different weight, and she remembered a small detail she had missed at the time. The way he had paused for half a second when he looked down at her throat in the fitting room, his gaze passing over the place where the silver chain disappeared beneath the silk. "You knew," she said, and her voice suddenly turned cold, her hand stopping halfway with the cloth. Desmond opened his eyes and looked at her. "What are you talking about?" "The name Houlihan." She stood, taking a step back from the chair, looking at him as though she were seeing him for the first time. "A man like you does not hire a stranger to be his fake fiancée without investigating her down to the last thread. You dug into me. You knew about my mother, about Poppy, about the hospital bills, so you also knew my grandmother's maiden name. You had heard that name before I ever walked into that room tonight, hadn't you? Tell me the truth, Desmond. You suspected who I was." There was a long moment of silence, and she saw his jaw tighten, and that hesitation answered her before he even opened his mouth. "I did not know for certain," he said at last, his voice roughening. "Priest found the name in your file. Houlihan. It stirred something, an old story I overheard when I was a child, a name people never spoke aloud. But it was only a common Irish surname. Thousands of people carry it. I had no proof, only a feeling." "A feeling," Maeve repeated, and the laugh that broke out of her sounded so bitter it startled even her. "So you brought me here, into a room full of people who killed my entire bloodline, on a feeling that I might be someone they would want to erase. You made me a piece on your board, Desmond. You threw me onto the table to see what would happen, to see whether your feeling was right." "It was not like that," he said, trying to sit up and grimacing from the pain in his side. "I needed someone outside the system, that is true. The name was only one more reason I became curious." Curious. Her voice trembled, not from anger, but from something far deeper and more wounded. "I gave you exactly one condition. One. I told you not to lie to me about anything that could leave my daughter without a mother. And you looked me straight in the eyes and promised. All while you were bringing me into a place where I could have died. Wearing a ring you suspected might make the entire room want to kill me, and you did not say one word to me." She took another step back, and the distance between them now was no longer just a few steps across the floor. "Poppy almost lost her mother tonight, and you knew that possibility existed before we ever got into the car." Desmond did not deny it. He could not. He only sat there, the most dangerous man in New York, with a wound in his side and a strange helplessness on his face, watching the fragile thing that had only just begun between them crack apart before his eyes. "Maeve," he said softly. "Don't," she cut in, and her eyes had filled with tears, but her voice had turned to steel. "You kept your part of the bargain. The money will be transferred, and I am done here." Then she turned and walked out of the room, leaving him sitting alone in the dark with the true price of the first lie he had ever told her. The door had barely closed behind Maeve when Priest entered through another passage, and from the look on the old advisor's face alone, Desmond knew that one more thing was about to collapse on a night already reduced to ruins. Priest placed a phone on the bedside table, its screen showing a chain of messages and a recording waiting to be played. "I suspected Serafina was not clever enough to stage all of this on her own," Priest said, his voice low and heavy. "Ambition. A widow like her has more than enough of that, but to know exactly which girl needed to be brought here tonight, to know which file was sitting in your archive, that required someone on the inside. Someone who knew every move you made." He pressed play, and a familiar voice filled the room, distorted by the recording but unmistakable. It was the voice of Hugo Greco, Desmond's cousin, the man who had sat at the same family table with him for years, the man who had always smiled and nodded and stood in the second row of every photograph. In the recording, Hugo's voice was whispering to Serafina, arranging, promising, laying out every step. "Bring the Donnelly girl to the wedding. Let the ring be revealed. Let Augustin recognize it." And then, in the chaos when the entire room turned against Desmond for bringing a mortal threat into their midst, Hugo would rise, calm and trustworthy, to take the chair he had coveted his whole life. Desmond sat motionless, the final pieces dropping into place with a coldness that almost stole his breath. "There is one more thing," Priest said, and this time his voice lowered almost to a whisper. "I dug into the Houlihan name the way you told me to, and I found the list of families present in that dark room 30 years ago, the ones who voted to erase that bloodline. One of the names on that list, Desmond, was Hugo's father. The silence in the room grew thick, because now the circle had closed in a way so poisonous it almost felt like fate. Hugo had not only betrayed Desmond to steal the throne. Hugo was the son of one of the men who had murdered Cormac and Cyrus Houlihan 3 decades earlier. He had used his own father's crime as a weapon, dragging the last granddaughter of the victims out of the shadows not to give her justice, but to use her as a knife in his cousin's back. He had been willing to let Maeve be killed all over again, finishing the work his father had left unfinished, all for ambition. Something inside Desmond, something he had restrained and controlled for 20 years so he could become a Don instead of a beast, now began to rise, cold and lethal. He thought of Maeve, of the hurt in her eyes when she walked out of this room, of how she had nearly died tonight because of a scheme she had not even known existed. He thought of the 5-year-old girl named Poppy who had almost become an orphan. And he thought of Hugo, somewhere in this estate right now, perhaps still smiling, still believing his plan had only gone slightly off course and had not failed completely. Desmond rose from the bed, ignoring the tearing pain in his side, his face returning to the expressionless mask the whole city feared, but his eyes were burning with a black fire that made even Priest, who had known him since he was a boy sleeping on church steps, feel a chill. "Find him," Desmond said, his voice terrifyingly soft. "Find Hugo and bring him to me. I will end this myself." Priest looked at him for a moment, recognized the deadly intent in that voice, and silently nodded before turning away, leaving Desmond standing alone in the dark room, with a fury gnawing through 20 years of self-control. They found Hugo Greco, trying to slip out of the estate through the servants' rear entrance, and they dragged him into an empty room on the ground floor, throwing him onto the stone floor at Desmond's feet. Every trace of the calm confidence Hugo had worn for so many years was gone now, revealing what lay beneath, a greedy and cowardly man, his face bloodless, his eyes darting in search of an escape that did not exist. "Desmond," he stammered, raising both hands. "Listen to me first. This is not what it looks like. Your father," Desmond cut in, his voice soft and cold as falling snow, "sat in the room that ordered the death of an innocent woman and her husband 30 years ago. And tonight you meant to let their granddaughter die again, right before my eyes, only so you could sit in my chair. Tell me, Hugo, what does that look like to you?" Hugo had no answer. Desmond took one step forward, and now there was something in his hand, and the whole room seemed to hold its breath, because every Greco man standing around them knew that look on their boss's face, and they knew what it meant. 20 years of self-control were hanging by a thread, and that thread was about to snap. But in that very moment, the door flew open. Maeve stood there at the threshold. She had heard the commotion, had turned back instead of getting into the car as she had intended, and now she was staring at the scene before her with wide eyes. She looked at the man kneeling on the floor, at the object in Desmond's hand, at the death-like mask on the face of the man who had just bled to save her, and instead of running, she stepped inside. "Desmond, stop." He did not turn around. "You should go, Maeve. You do not need to see this." "I do," she said, and she moved closer, slowly, until she was near enough to place her hand on his arm, the arm holding that weapon. She could feel the muscle beneath the fabric pulled tight as steel wire, feel the fury vibrating through every fiber of him. "He deserves to be punished. I know. He meant to let me die. He betrayed you. He is the son of the man who killed my grandparents. I know all of that. But if you do this, if you end it this way, you will never get out again." Desmond finally turned to look at her, and in his eyes was a torment she had never seen before. "This is my world," he said hoarsely. "This is how things end in my world. He will never stop. If I let him live, he will come back, then lock him away, take everything from him, make him harmless. You have an entire empire that knelt at my feet tonight, Desmond. You have enough power to do that without turning yourself into what his father once was." Her voice softened, and she stepped even closer, close enough that only he could hear her. "I have a 5-year-old daughter. Tonight she almost lost her mother. I cannot bring her into a world where every problem is solved with blood on the floor. And I do not think, deep down, that you want to live in that world anymore either. Do not let my daughter grow up in a world like that, and do not let yourself grow old and die in it." A long silence passed, stretched tight enough to steal the breath from the room. Then, slowly, Desmond lowered his hand. He looked at Hugo, trembling on the floor, with a contempt colder than death. "Take him away," he ordered his men. "He will be held in the old place. Strip every asset, cut every line of contact, guard him day and night. He will live. But from this moment on, Hugo Greco no longer exists. They dragged Hugo away, the traitor crying and cursing, and when the room was empty, Desmond turned to Maeve, something fragile and hopeful flickering in his eyes. But she had stepped back. "You did the right thing," she said softly. "But that does not erase the fact that you hid the truth from me. I still need to go home, Desmond. Poppy is waiting for me." And this time, when she turned away, he did not call her back. 3 days later, after she had held Poppy so tightly, the little girl had to wriggle free and giggle, after she had sat for hours beside her mother's hospital bed, and, for the first time, did not have to worry about the bill, because the money Desmond had promised had been transferred exactly as he said it would be. Maeve finally did the thing she had been putting off ever since the night at the Fontaine estate. She took the silver ring off the chain, held it in her palm, and went to the address written in Cormac Houlihan's will, the one she had memorized by heart, an old bank in Lower Manhattan. The kind of bank whose vaults had existed longer than the modern city rising around it. The manager looked at the seal on the ring, matched it against a file that had slept inside the system for 3 decades, and quietly led her down a stone corridor to a steel door. Inside the vault, an old safe was waiting for her, and when she pressed the seal on the ring into the lock made specifically for it, the mechanism inside gave a low groan and released after 30 years of silence. Maeve thought she knew what lay inside. She thought there would be ownership papers, notarized documents, legal proof of her inheritance, things like what she had found in the auction file. But when she opened the safe, she realized her grandfather had been far smarter and far more frightening than she had imagined. Beside the ownership documents was something else. A ledger, thick, bound in leather, its paper edges yellowed by time, and when Maeve opened it beneath the dim light of the vault, her breath caught in her throat. Cormac Houlihan had not only been the bookkeeper who helped the families hide their crimes. He had recorded everything, every stream of dirty money, every illegal shipment, every name, every date, every crime the East Coast families had committed during the years he worked for them. This was not an accounting book. This was a bomb. In her hands now was enough evidence to destroy not only the Fontaine family, not only the men who had killed her grandparents, but all of them, every family that had knelt at her feet that night, and the Greco family too, Desmond as well. Maeve sat down on the cold stone bench inside the vault, the ledger trembling in her hands, and for the first time she fully understood the weight of what she held. She could end all of it. She could give this ledger to the federal authorities and watch the entire underworld that had stolen her family collapse into ash. That would be justice. That would be the vengeance her grandparents had never received. But doing so would also mean dragging down the man who had placed his body between her and a blade, the man who had chosen to imprison his enemy instead of killing him because she had begged him not to. And she realized, with a clarity that made her go cold, that the moment anyone in that world knew she possessed this, her life and Poppy's would not be worth a cent. They would no longer kneel, they would hunt her. So Maeve did what she did best, she thought. She took the ledger and every file to a lawyer she trusted, an old man with no ties to the underworld, and she copied everything into multiple sets. She sealed them and placed them in different locations, giving the lawyer one instruction, clear and irreversible. If she died, if she disappeared, if anything unusual happened to her or to her daughter, the entire contents of the ledger would automatically be sent to the federal authorities, to the press, to every agency of justice capable of making that whole empire explode. She did not do it for revenge. She did it to survive. The ledger was no longer a bomb. It was a shield. It was the invisible chain that would keep hundreds of predators on their knees. And when Maeve stepped out of the bank into the daylight, she understood that she now held a power greater than anything Desmond Greco had ever possessed, and that she now had to decide what kind of person she would become while holding it. A destroyer, or something better. A week passed in a peace Maeve almost did not dare trust. And then, late one afternoon, just as she had picked Poppy up from preschool and was crossing the underground parking garage beneath their new building, that peace shattered. A figure stepped out from between 2 rows of cars, and when Maeve realized who it was, the blood in her body seemed to freeze. Hugo Greco. His face was hollow and filthy, his expensive suit now wrinkled and soiled, his eyes streaked with the desperate light of a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. Somehow he had escaped custody, taking advantage of a careless moment, a bought guard. That same traitor, before fleeing the city, had handed Hugo one final piece of information: the encrypted address of the secure building Desmond had just bought for Maeve. And now he stood there, blocking the space between her and her car. Maeve did the only thing the motherly instinct inside her screamed at her to do. She reached behind her, pulled Poppy close behind her back, and used her own body as the wall between her daughter and the man before them. "Poppy, hold on to Mommy's leg very tightly and close your eyes. All right. We're playing hide and seek," she said, her voice astonishingly calm, though her heart was pounding wildly, and the little girl, trusting her mother completely, buried her face against Maeve's leg without knowing what was happening. "You have something I need," Hugo said, his voice trembling but full of threat, "the ledger. I know old Cormac left it behind. My father talked about it until the day he died, that damned ledger that could bury all of us. Give it to me and I'll disappear. I'll use it to take back everything my nephew stole from me." "I don't have it on me," Maeve said, still keeping her voice steady, still keeping her body between him and her daughter. "Do you really think I'm stupid enough to carry something like that when I'm picking up my child? Then you will take me to it." He stepped forward, and Maeve stepped back exactly one matching step, keeping the distance unchanged, keeping Poppy always behind her. In her mind, a cold and calculating part of herself was racing, and she realized he had no weapon in his hand, that he was desperate rather than planned, and that made him both less dangerous and more unpredictable. She slipped one hand into her coat pocket, her fingers finding her phone, and from memory she pressed the name. She had sworn to herself she would never call again, the only name in the entire city that could arrive in time. She did not bring the phone to her ear. She only let the call connect inside her pocket, and she began to speak louder, more clearly, turning every word into a lighthouse. "Listen, Hugo. You do not have to do this here, in the underground parking garage beneath my building, with my 5-year-old daughter standing right here." She saw a flicker of confusion pass through his eyes as she emphasized each detail about the location, but he was too desperate to understand. On the other end of the line, Desmond Greco answered the phone. Ever since Hugo's escape 3 days earlier, a cold unease had kept him on edge, and at that exact moment, he and Priest were already in his car, driving just a few blocks away to check on Maeve's security. Hearing that voice, coming through his phone, hearing the name Hugo and the words 5-year-old daughter, his entire world narrowed to a single sharp point. Desmond slammed his foot on the gas, his vehicle roaring toward her location, before Priest could even ask what was happening. "I do not want to hurt you," Hugo said, and for the first time Maeve heard something broken in his voice, a patheticness even greater than the threat. "I only want my life back. You could not understand what it feels like to have everything taken from you." "Yes, I can," Maeve answered softly, and in one strange moment, amid the fear, she almost pitied him. "I understand better than you think. My family had everything taken from them too, by your father. But I will not let my daughter pay the price for that. Not today. Not ever." And she held her ground, a mother standing between her child and the bloody past of both their bloodlines, stretching out every second, praying that the sound of wheels she was waiting for would arrive in time. The screech of tires against concrete echoed through the underground parking garage before Hugo could react, and a black car surged forward to block the exit, the door flying open even before the vehicle had fully stopped. Desmond stepped out, and there was something in the way he moved, in the deadly stillness surrounding him, that made Hugo take a step back by instinct. Priest and 2 other men spread out behind him, silently closing off every escape, but Desmond lifted one hand to signal them to stop. This was his. His eyes swept over the scene in a single instant, taking in everything, Hugo desperate and empty-handed, Maeve standing with her spine straight as a wall of steel, and behind her, clinging tightly to her mother's leg with her eyes squeezed shut, was one small living soul playing a game she did not know was real. Poppy, and it was the sight of that child that held back the rage boiling in Desmond's blood. "Hugo," he said, his voice terrifyingly soft, "you escaped from the place where you were allowed to live so you could come here, stand in front of a 5-year-old child, and threaten her mother. Do you know what I meant to do to you 1 week ago? I had something in my hand, and I was one breath away from ending your life. This woman stopped me. She begged me to spare your miserable life." Hugo trembled, his eyes darting from Desmond to Maeve and back again. "Then do it," he hissed, desperation pushing him over the edge of reason. Do what we both know you are best at. That is your nature, Desmond. That is the nature of all of us. Greco blood. For a moment, the air in the parking garage grew thick, and Maeve held her breath because she saw the anger in Desmond's eyes, saw 20 years of instinct screaming at him to end everything the only way his world had ever taught him. But then his gaze slipped down again to the little girl, with her eyes closed behind her mother, and something inside him changed forever. No, Desmond said, and his voice sounded completely different, as though even he were hearing it for the first time. That is what you want me to believe. But you are wrong, Hugo. I am not your father, and I will not let that child see a man end things in blood. Not today. Never again. He pulled out his phone, and instead of signaling to his men, he pressed the 3 numbers a man like him should never have called, the 3 numbers that reached the very world of law he had spent his whole life avoiding. There is a man harassing a woman and a child in a parking garage, he said into the phone, his eyes never leaving Hugo. He is also someone you have been looking for a long time. I will hold him here until you arrive. Hugo's face went white when he understood. Desmond Greco. The Dawn of Brooklyn was handing him over to the police. Not to a grave beneath a peer foundation, but to justice, to the courts, to an ordinary and living end that, in their world, was more frightening than death. You cannot do this, Hugo whispered. This is a betrayal of everything we... No, Desmond cut in. This is how it ends. His men restrained Hugo, this time not to punish him, but to wait, and Desmond turned his back on the traitor, as though he no longer existed. He walked toward Maeve slowly, both hands lowered so she could see they were empty, and he knelt on one knee on the concrete so he was level with the child who still had her eyes closed. Hide and seek is over, little girl, he said, and the voice of the most dangerous man in New York became so gentle that Maeve almost did not recognize it. You won. You are the very best at hiding. Poppy opened her eyes a little, looked at the strange man kneeling in front of her, and instead of fear, she smiled. That night, after the police had taken Hugo away, after Poppy had finally fallen asleep with a stuffed bear clutched tightly in her arms, never knowing what her mother had just endured, Maeve opened the door and let Desmond step into her small apartment. He looked out of place among those simple things, a beast accustomed to dark rooms and stone castles, now standing among a child's coloring pages taped to the refrigerator, and perhaps it was that very displacement that finally made him lower the armor he had worn for 20 years. They sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, and for the first time he began to speak. I do not remember my parents, he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the cup of tea cooling in his hands without truly seeing it. They died when I was too young. I grew up on the streets, sleeping on church steps, eating what other people threw away. When you are a child with no one in the world, you learn one thing very quickly, that the world will devour you alive if you show even the smallest softness. So I stopped being soft. I learned to make people afraid before they could hurt me. Priest found me when I was 12, and the Greco family took me in, but by then whatever inside me could still feel had gone completely numb. I thought it was extinguished forever. For 20 years I believed I was only the thing the world had made me into. A monster in a suit. Maeve listened without interrupting, and in the warm yellow light of the kitchen, she saw that the man the whole city feared was truly only a child who had never been held. I hid the Houlihan name from you, he continued, lifting his eyes to hers, not because I meant to use you as a piece on a board, though I know that is how it looked to you. I hid it because I was afraid. I was afraid that if I told you what I suspected, you would run, and I would never learn the truth. And I was afraid of something else too. Something I did not dare name until the moment I saw Serafina lunging toward you. I was afraid of losing you, before I even understood what you meant to me. Maeve was silent for a long time, her hands wrapped around the warm teacup. Do you know why I did not fall apart, Desmond? She said at last. For 2 years I worked 2 jobs, watched my mother fade, cried in the bathroom so my daughter would not hear. I had 1,000 reasons to give up, but every morning I still got up, still went to work, still smiled at my little girl, because there is one small soul in this world who calls me mother, and as long as she needs me, I am not allowed to collapse. That love did not make me weak. It is the strongest thing I have ever known. It is what kept me alive. She lifted her head and her eyes met his. You were wrong to hide the truth from me. You put me in danger, and I was angry with you down to the bone. But I also saw you bleed to shield me without hesitation. I saw you lower your weapon because I asked you to. And today I saw you kneel on filthy concrete to tell a child a lie that she had won a game, instead of letting her see the truth. The monster you are talking about would never do those things. Something broke open in Desmond's eyes, something he had locked away since he was a child sleeping on church steps. I forgive you, Maeve said softly, and she reached across the table, placing her hand over his scarred one, the hand that had done so many terrible things and tonight had chosen mercy. Not because what you did was right, but because I believe the man I am seeing now is the real one, and that man deserves a chance. And for the first time in 20 years, Desmond Greco lowered his head and let another person see him cry. Bianca Greco and Tobias Fontaine's wedding was finally held 2 weeks later, delayed from the original plan but no less magnificent. And this time, when Maeve walked into the Fontaine estate, the air inside the hall was entirely different. There were no hungry, probing stares, no contemptuous whispers. Instead, as she passed, the most powerful dons on the East Coast lowered their heads in greeting, and the wives who had once looked at her as though she were a pawn now offered her glasses of champagne with cautious respect. But Maeve had not come to enjoy their submission. She had requested a meeting, and in a closed room behind the grand hall, she sat across from Augustine Fontaine and the heads of the families, with Desmond standing beside her not as a protector but as an equal, and she placed on the table the truth every one of them feared. I know about the ledger, she said, and she saw each of their faces turn pale. My grandfather's ledger. I know what it records, and I know what it can do to every person sitting in this room. Every crime, every name, every date. Enough to bury all of you beneath the light of the law for the rest of your lives. A deadly silence fell. You are waiting for me to demand revenge, Maeve continued, her voice calm but immovable. That is what your world would do. That is what my grandparents never received. But I am not you, and I will not build my daughter's future on a sea of blood, even if it is the blood of people who deserve to bleed. So this is what will happen. She placed her hand on the table. The ledger will never be made public as long as you do exactly what I say. The harbor, the warehouses, the companies, everything that on paper has always belonged to my bloodline will be transformed. Piece by piece, year by year, they will become truly legitimate businesses. Clean money. Real work for real people. You are already wealthy enough, gentlemen. Now you will learn how to be wealthy without the things that make you sleep with a knife beneath your pillow. She turned to Desmond, and he nodded, because they had discussed this through many nights. In the Brooklyn harbor, she said, the thing my grandfather died trying to protect will carry a new purpose. A portion of its profits every year will go into a fund for children who have no one in the world. Children who sleep on church steps. Children this world is ready to devour alive if no one reaches out a hand. Because I have learned something, gentlemen. Real power is not making people afraid. Any thug can make someone afraid. Real power is making people safe. It is making people respected. Augustine Fontaine looked at her for a long time, the old man who had witnessed 30 years of violence and betrayal, and in his eyes now was something almost like relief, as though the burden he had carried all those years had finally found a way out. Your grandmother, he said softly, would have been very proud, and one by one, the most powerful men on the East Coast nodded their agreement not only because fear forced them, but because for the first time in many years, someone had shown them another path. A path they could walk without losing any more of their souls. When Maeve and Desmond stepped back into the grand hall, where Bianca was dancing in the arms of her new husband, beneath the flickering candlelight, Maeve felt something she had never felt in her entire life. Not power, meaning, she had entered this room 2 weeks earlier as a cleaning woman they looked down on, and now she left it as a woman who had changed the fate of an entire underworld. Not with blood, but with the courage to choose something better. That evening, when they returned to the small apartment and the city lights stretched below like a galaxy fallen to Earth, Desmond stood beside the window and, for the first time in his life, spoke aloud the decision his heart had quietly made days before. I am going to step away, he said, turning back to look at Maeve. From all of it. I will hand over what needs to be handed over, transform what needs to be transformed, and I will walk out of the darkness I have lived in my whole life. I do not know who I will be when I am no longer the Dawn of Brooklyn, but I know I want to find out. I want to find out beside you, if you will allow it. Before Maeve could answer, a tiny voice sounded from the bedroom doorway. Poppy had woken up, rubbing her eyes, still holding her stuffed bear, and the little girl ran across the room, without the slightest fear to stand before that large man. She looked up at him for a long moment with the clear curiosity of childhood, then reached out her tiny hand and took his scarred fingers. "You're the man who played hide-and-seek with me," she said. "I like you. Will you stay and keep playing?" And something inside Desmond Greco's chest, something that had been frozen for 30 years, ever since he was a child sleeping on cold church steps, finally melted completely. He knelt down, cradling that small hand in his own, as though it were the most precious thing he had ever been allowed to touch. And when he lifted his eyes to Maeve over the child's head, those eyes said everything words could not. Maeve stepped closer, and when she bent down to kiss him, it was not the possessive kiss of a powerful dawn, nor the beginning of a bargain, but the quiet promise of a man choosing to become better because of love, and of a woman brave enough to believe that even the darkest thing could be healed by mercy. 6 months later, Brooklyn Harbor was no longer a place of midnight shipments and whispers in the dark. In its place stood a community center lit brightly day and night, where homeless children were fed, educated, and given a safe place to call home. The sign at the gate bore a simple name, the Houlihan Scholarship Fund, in memory of a man and a woman who had died trying to protect their family, and in honor of the granddaughter who had revived that name not with revenge, but with kindness. Desmond Greco, the man whose name the entire city once lowered its voice to speak, now spent his afternoons there teaching children how to play chess, and for the first time in his life he slept soundly without a knife under his pillow. Maeve's mother, Eilish, was doing better thanks to proper treatment, and every weekend, that small family went to the beach together, where Poppy ran barefoot across the sand, and her laughter mingled with the sound of the waves, a sound no empire and no fortune could ever buy. This story, ladies and gentlemen, is not only the story of a kingpin and a single mother. It is a reminder that a person's worth is never found in their status or wealth, that the woman mopping floors at midnight can carry more dignity inside her than a room full of powerful men, and that even the darkest heart can find light when someone is willing to look into it and believe it is still worth saving. Mercy is not weakness, forgiveness is not surrender, and sometimes the greatest strength in the world is not making others kneel, but reaching out a hand to help them stand. If this story has touched your heart in any way, please press the like button, share it with someone you think needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so we can keep bringing you many more moving and meaningful stories every day. We would truly love to know how you feel about Maeve and Desmond's story, so please leave a comment and share the thoughts from deep within your heart, because every word you write is a precious source of encouragement that helps us continue telling stories like this. Thank you for listening until the very last moment. May you, the person watching this video, always have good health, a joyful life, peace, and calm in every passing day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.